They threw rotten oranges on his ranch, and he built a company from it. Caleb Miller was 23 years old when he inherited his grandfather's land, and he hadn't even finished unpacking his things when the trouble began. The smell hit him before he saw what was happening, a heavy, suffocating sourness that the cold wind of that January morning pushed through the window of the small brick house that would be his new home. When he stepped outside to look, he found a dump truck unloading tons of rotten oranges right in the middle of the property his grandfather had worked for over 40 years. 3 men stood at the edge of the dirt road, laughing and pointing as the orange decaying pile grew before Caleb's eyes. One of them shouted over the engine noise, a welcome gift for the boy who thought he was going to be a rancher. Caleb stood still, hands at his sides, feeling the sour, rotten smell invade his lungs. He didn't answer. He looked at the mountain of spoiled oranges and felt something harden inside his chest, not from fear but from a silent anger he didn't yet know how to use. The inherited property was small by the region's standards, a small rural town where the grey winter sky seemed to weigh on everything. The orange grove that Grandpa Arthur had planted decades ago was recovering from a blight that had devastated the previous harvest, and the younger trees were still fragile, dependent on daily care. The main house was simple: plastered brick walls, a red tile roof, wooden windows that creaked in the wind. There was an old plank shed out back, with tools lined up on the wall like forgotten soldiers. It was all that remained of his grandfather, and it was all Caleb had. He had the young face of someone who didn't yet know much of the world, dark skin that shone even in the cold, eyes with that kind of attention that always seems to be analyzing something others missed. He wore an orange jacket his mother had given him when he finished his technical course in agribusiness 2 years before. At that moment, standing before the mountain of rotten oranges, with the orange jacket contrasting against the heavy grey, cloud-filled sky, Caleb looked small. But he wasn't broken. Not yet. The 3 men who had ordered that rot dumped on his land weren't strangers. Caleb had heard of each of them through his grandfather. The oldest, Mr. Silas, was the biggest orange producer in the region, a man with white hair and broad shoulders who had built his empire by buying land from neighbors when they were at rock bottom. He had tried to buy Grandpa Arthur's property twice, and twice he had been turned down politely, making it clear the answer would never change. With Caleb, though, Mr. Silas had changed his approach. He showed up a week after the grandfather's funeral with a cash offer that was little more than an insult wrapped in paper. Caleb had refused without hesitation. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 days before the problem started. The second man on the roadside was Mr. Vernon, a rancher with a big belly and a cap that was always dirty, who never made a decision without first looking at Mr. Silas. He was the kind of man who existed in the shadow of the powerful, always laughing at others' jokes and never doing anything on his own. The third man, Mr. Ronald, was quieter. That day with the oranges, while the other 2 laughed, Mr. Ronald stood with his arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression Caleb couldn't decipher. It wasn't joy. Maybe it was discomfort. Maybe it was fear. Caleb didn't have time to find out. When the truck drove off and the 3 men disappeared down the road, Caleb walked to the center of the property and stood before the mountain of rotten oranges. The smell was unbearable. Flies were already starting to show up. He stayed there for a long time in silence, thinking about his grandfather. Mr. Arthur had pulled life out of that soil with his own hands for nearly 5 decades. He had lost harvests, he had lost money, he had gone through seasons with less than what was needed, and he had never asked anyone for anything. He spent the nights of Caleb's childhood telling stories about the land, the seasons, the secrets the soil held for those who knew how to wait. When the boy grew up and went to study agro-industry in the city, it was his grandfather who paid for the first month's transportation, and when Mr. Arthur got sick and the land went untended for 6 months, it was Caleb who came back during break to work alongside the old man without complaining, learning more than any classroom could teach. The inheritance wasn't big. It was heavy. Caleb called his mother that night. Mrs. Eleanor worked as a cook for a family in a city 40 miles away. She had raised her son alone after her husband left when Caleb was 6, and she carried in every wrinkle on her face the weight of years of hard work and little recognition. She was a small woman, grey hair that she had dyed black for years before giving up, eyes that always seemed to be sizing up a situation before reacting. "What time is it, my son?" she answered, with the voice of someone who was already asleep. "Mom, they dumped rotten oranges on Grandpa's land." Silence. "How much?" "A whole truckload. Maybe more. There's a mountain in the middle of the property." She was quiet for a while. Caleb could hear the distant sound of a television in the back of the house where she worked. "Sell that land, Caleb?" "No." "Son." "No, Mom. I'm not selling it." She sighed with that kind of tiredness that isn't physical. The conversation ended soon after, without resolution, leaving Caleb sitting on the edge of the bed in his grandfather's small house, staring at the wooden ceiling that creaked with the wind outside. He slept little. Early in the morning, before the sun rose, he went back to the orange grove. The smell of the rotten oranges had already spread throughout the entire property. Caleb ran his hand over one of the newest trees, the ones Mr. Arthur had planted 3 years before getting sick, and felt the leaves between his fingers. It was still okay, for now. In the days that followed, Caleb discovered that the rotten oranges were just the beginning. Mr. Silas had filed a lawsuit, claiming a dispute over the right-of-way for the water that supplied the orange grove. The well his grandfather used was on a strip of land that the older farmer claimed was for the exclusive use of his own property. It was an old dispute, but one that had been informally resolved decades ago. Grandfather Arthur had never worried because it had never been challenged. Now, with the lawsuit underway and a court order suspending the use of the water until the matter was clarified, Caleb found himself without irrigation for the orange grove. He started carrying buckets. He woke up before 4 in the morning, fetched water from a farther alternative spot, and carried bucket after bucket along the rows of orange trees. It was back-breaking, hand-wrecking work. After 3 days, his arms went numb at night and ached in the morning. After a week, he had lost almost 10 pounds. A neighbour named Mr. Douglas, who had a very small plot on the other side of the fence, showed up in the second week with a wheelbarrow and said he was going to help. He didn't ask for an explanation, didn't ask questions. He simply grabbed a bucket and joined in. He was in his early 60s, with a scraggly beard and hands that looked like leather from so much work. He was the kind of man Caleb had met few times in his life, one who acts before thinking about profit. "Silas did this to your father too," Mr. Douglas commented one morning as they filled the buckets. Caleb looked up. "My grandfather." "I know." To Arthur. Years ago, when the old man refused to sell the land for the first time, Silas tried to block access to the main road, claiming that part of the path went through his land. The dispute lasted 6 months. Arthur won because he had the right document. "What document?" Mr. Douglas scratched his beard. "I don't know for sure. I know Constance knows. She lived on the other side even back then. That woman keeps a lot in her head." Caleb stored the name away. Mrs. Constance was a 72-year-old woman who lived in a little blue-painted house on the property next to Caleb's on the east side. She had been a close friend of Grandpa Arthur, one of those old friendships sustained by decades of quiet trust and exchanging supplies over the fence. Caleb had only seen her once after the wake, when she showed up with a pot of soup and sat in the kitchen for an hour, barely speaking. When Caleb went to visit her, she was in the yard, pruning a rosemary bush with a little rusty pair of scissors. She was small, stooped forward, her completely white hair tied in a bun. She had lively eyes that didn't match the rest of her tired body. "I knew you'd show up," she said, without looking at him. "How did you know, Ma'am?" "Because Silas went after the water. That's his way of starting. He does that when he wants someone's land. First he goes for the water, then the access, then the debts. That's how it was with Julian, over there on the other side of the creek. That's how it was with the Moore family, who sold their vegetable garden for half the price because they couldn't take it anymore." She finally looked at him. "Sit here." Caleb sat on a wooden stool while Mrs. Constance set the scissors aside and wiped her hands on her apron. "Your grandfather told me something you need to know. He said he was going to tell you when you grew up, but time went by faster than he'd planned." "What is it?" She went inside the house and came back with an old envelope. yellowed at the edges. "This is a copy. The original is registered at the notary office in the city. Arthur asked me to keep the copy here, afraid that the original might one day disappear." Caleb opened the envelope. It was an old document, typewritten with faded signatures and seals. It took him a few minutes of reading before he understood what he was seeing. "This is a deed for the use of the well," he said slowly. "Perpetual right of use, formally granted over 50 years ago, when the original property was divided between two brothers, and one of them got the well. Arthur bought the share of the brother who ended up without the well, and the usage agreement came with it. It's all recorded." Caleb stared at the paper. "So Silas's lawsuit has no basis." "It never did, but he's betting that you don't know that, or that you won't have the money for a lawyer who will present the right document at the right time." She crossed her arms with the steadfastness of someone who had seen a lot happen. "But there's something else, Caleb. Something that explains why Silas is so desperate about this land." Caleb looked at her. "There's a plan to widen the secondary roads that connect this region to the distribution hubs on the north side, and the only viable route goes right through your property. A big distributor in the area has made a deal with Silas for this expansion, but he needs your land for the project to make sense. Your property is worth 3 times more than what he offered." The wind passed through the trees in the yard. Caleb was quiet for a long time. "Why did my grandfather never tell me this?" Mrs. Constance tilted her head slightly. "Because he thought the land was enough for what it produced. He didn't want you to think about money when you looked at it. He wanted you to see it the way he did, as a place of honest work." Caleb carefully folded the document and put it in the pocket of his orange jacket. "Thank you, Mrs. Constance. Take care of the land, my boy." "Mr. Arthur spent his whole life taking care of her for you." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The information about the real value of the property changed something in Caleb. It didn't make him feel more secure. On the contrary, it made him more aware of the magnitude of what he was facing. But it also turned the silent anger into something more concrete. Now he knew why he was being pressured, and knowing why made everything different. The immediate problem, however, was another. In the 3rd week after the rotten oranges were dumped, the sour smell that had spread across the land began to attract a type of tiny insect that Caleb had never seen in such large numbers. They were little black beetles that settled on the leaves of the youngest orange trees, piercing the bark of the tender branches and leaving a sticky sap that darkened over time. In less than a week, 3 entire rows of the newest trees began to show yellowed, wilted leaves. Caleb panicked. Those trees were the future of the grove. The older ones were still producing, but in smaller quantities than before the previous blight. It was the young ones that would ensure enough volume to sell in the coming years. Losing them meant starting from scratch, years of waiting and no income. He called the only agronomist he knew in the region, a man named Dr. Harold, who had a small office in the city and served rural properties around those parts. He was a serious professional, middle-aged, who arrived with a worn leather briefcase and spent 2 hours examining each row of the grove. "The insect is attracted to the fermentation of the rotten oranges," he explained at the end, hands behind his back, looking at the orange pile that still occupied part of the land. "As long as this stays here, they keep reproducing, and while the insects are here, the young trees keep getting attacked." "How long to recover?" Dr. Harold took a deep breath. "If you treat the soil, control the infestation, and have luck with the weather, 2 years, maybe 2.5. Caleb closed his eyes for a second. 2 years with no production to sell. In commercial volume, yes. You might have a small yield from the older trees, perhaps enough for your own use, but to sell to the market in quantities that make it worthwhile, the 2 years. The agronomist gave an estimate for the treatment. It was an amount Caleb didn't have. He had at most half of it, with what he'd saved over the last 2 years working as an assistant at an agricultural cooperative before taking over the inheritance. He paid for the first visit and said he'd call to confirm the second. He didn't call. He couldn't afford it. He spent 2 days trying to figure a way out. He called a bank where he had an account and asked about a rural loan. They said he'd need collateral he didn't have. He called another bank. The answer was similar. On the third night, his mother called back. "How are you?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice was different, softer, as if she knew he was at his breaking point. "I'm fine," he lied. "Caleb." "Mom, I'm fine." "You're not fine. I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Tell me what's really going on." He told her. He told her about the insects, about the trees, about the 2-year wait, about the banks that denied the loan. He told her about the water lawsuit and what Mrs. Constance had revealed about the real value of the land. He told her everything, non-stop, like someone opening a faucet that had been shut for a long time. Mrs. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "I have my retirement savings put away. It's not much, but—" "No," he cut her off, firmer than he intended. "Not that." "Son, Mom, you worked your whole life for that money. I'm not using your retirement money for a ranch that might go under. No, I'll figure this out another way." Another silence. "What way?" "I don't know yet, but I'll find out." After he hung up, he sat on the edge of his grandfather's bed for a long time, staring at the wall. There was a shelf with his grandfather's old books, notebooks with crop notes, a framed photo of young Mr. Arthur proudly holding an orange in front of a row of laden trees. Caleb got up, walked to the shelf, and started picking up the notebooks one by one. They were hardcover notebooks, some with peeling spines, filled with his grandfather's small, slanted handwriting. Records of harvests, weather, market prices, input costs. Decades of careful observation of a land the old man had learned to listen to. In an older notebook with a faded brown cover, he found a section separated by a folded strip of paper. The title was handwritten, "Alternative Uses, What the Land Gives That the Market Won't Buy." Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and started reading. His grandfather described uses he had discovered over the years for parts of oranges that would otherwise be discarded. The fermented juice of old oranges, diluted in water, worked as a natural cleaner that could cut through grease on wood and metal surfaces. The pressed pulp, mixed with soil in the right proportion, enriched the ground and sped up the decomposition of organic matter. There were notes on proportions, fermentation time, tests the old man had run over the years on tools, kitchen surfaces, the stone floor of the shed. Caleb read those pages 3 times. Then he looked out the window toward the mountain of rotten oranges still piled up outside. He stayed awake past midnight, thinking. Early in the morning, before the sun even came up, Caleb went into the shed and started looking for what was available. He found an old blender with a cracked pitcher, plastic buckets of different sizes, a makeshift press his grandfather had put together with 2 thick pieces of wood and metal screws. There were also wide-mouthed glass jars, the kind used for canning, stacked in a wooden box in the corner. Caleb carried the blender into the house, cleaned up the shed enough to work in it, and went to fetch oranges from the rotten pile. The smell was hard to bear up close. He improvised a nose cover with a damp cloth and started picking out the softest oranges, the ones that had already begun to ferment naturally. He filled 2 large buckets. The first tests were a disaster. The proportion his grandfather had noted was for a small batch, and Caleb messed up the dilution. The first batch was too acidic, strong enough to irritate the skin. He threw it out, adjusted, tried again. The second batch was too weak, almost ineffective. Adjusted again. On the 5th try, after 2 days of testing, he got a consistency that seemed right. A yellowish liquid with a strong but not harsh citrus smell that, when applied to a wooden surface, cut through the built-up grease with an ease that surprised Caleb. He tested it on the dirty counter in the shed. It worked better than he expected. He tested it on the rusty handles of the tools. The surface rust came off, and the metal had some shine again. He went into the house and tested it on the stone floor of the kitchen, which had gone uncleaned during the months his grandfather was sick. The floor came out gleaming in a way Caleb hadn't seen in years. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking at the reflection of his own orange jacket in the clean floor. He spent the night writing down the correct proportions in a new notebook he bought in town. The first jars he filled were glass bottles with reused lids. There was no label, no name, nothing but the product itself. But when his mother visited him the following weekend, she showed up unannounced on a Saturday morning with a container of food and that same worried look she always had. Caleb took her to the kitchen and showed her the floor. Mrs. Eleanor stopped at the doorway and looked at the ground. "What product did you use?" "I made it." She turned her head slowly, like someone who didn't understand. "What do you mean, made it?" "From the rotten oranges. There's a formula from Grandpa in an old notebook of his. I adapted it, adjusted the proportions. It works." She picked up one of the bottles from the counter, opened it, smelled it. "It smells like orange." "It's orange." She stood looking at the bottle for a while. Then she looked at her son. "And what are you going to do with this?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "I tried it in the shed, on the tools, on the floor. It works better than the cleaners we buy at the store for wood and metal." Mrs. Eleanor looked back at the bottle. Caleb knew that expression. It was when she was seriously evaluating something internally, without showing what she was thinking. "Let me take some," she said at last. "What for?" "I work for different families. I know other women who work for families. We're always looking for a good cleaning product." Caleb set aside 8 bottles. Mrs. Eleanor left with them under her arm, without promising anything, without building expectations. That was her way. She did things in silence and reported the results afterward. The following week was the longest of Caleb's life. He kept carrying buckets of water to the orange grove in the morning, making more cleaner in the afternoon, trying to sleep at night while the debts grew in thoughts he couldn't stop. The water lawsuit continued. The young trees kept getting weaker from the insects, though at a slower rate because he had started removing the rotten oranges from the pile little by little, using them in tests or burying the ones that weren't useful. On Thursday of that week, his mother called. "The 8 bottles were gone in 2 days," she said, without beating around the bush. "Beverly, who owns a grocery store in town, asked for 20. Caleb didn't answer right away. "Did you tell her I made it?" "I told her it was a high-quality handmade product. I told her it was natural, made from oranges. She tested it on a wooden shelf that was all stained with grease and was impressed. She asked for 20 bottles and said if they sell, she'll order more." Caleb stood still in the middle of the shed, holding the phone. "Mom, I know," she cut in, with a firm voice. "It's not a solution for everything, but it's something. Make the 20 bottles, deliver them to Beverly, see what happens." He made the 20 bottles in 3 days. His mother picked them up on the weekend and took them to the grocery store. They sold in 4 days. Beverly ordered 40. Beverly's grocery store was a small establishment in the town square, with wooden shelves painted white and a mixed smell of coffee, soap, and spices. Beverly was around 50 years old, with short hair dyed dark red, and a way of treating customers that blended friendliness with directness. When Caleb went in person to deliver the next 40 bottles, she received him behind the counter with her arms crossed and an evaluating look. "This product is different," she said right off the bat. "I sell a lot of things in this store for 20 years, and I know when something is really worth it. My customers are calling me asking if there's more." "There's more as long as there are oranges," Caleb said with a touch of irony that Beverly caught and appreciated with a faint smile. "Do you have a name for it?" Caleb realized he hadn't thought about that. "Not yet. Think about it. A product without a name won't go far. And make a label, even if it's printed on the computer and stuck on with tape. Appearance matters, even if the product speaks for itself." Caleb went home and spent 3 hours trying to think of a name. Nothing that came to mind seemed right. Late in the evening, looking at his grandfather's notebook open on the table, the idea came simply, almost obvious. Pure root. He printed the first labels on adhesive paper bought at the stationery store, stuck them on the bottles, and photographed them with his cell phone to show Beverly. She approved with a nod. "That looks better. Now think about how you'll scale this up, because with 40 bottles a week you won't get far." Caleb knew she was right. The problem was that to scale up, he needed more equipment, more bottles, more organized raw materials. The pile of rotten oranges on the land was shrinking as he used them, but in a chaotic way. He needed a process. It was while he was trying to mentally organize this process that the second serious threat arrived. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Mr. Silas had found out about the product. It wasn't a mystery. The farmer's brother-in-law frequented Beverly's grocery store and had bought 2 bottles of Pure Root for his wife. When she mentioned at home that the product was made from oranges by a new young man in the area, the brother-in-law mentioned it to Silas at a weekend lunch. Caleb didn't know this when, on a Wednesday morning, he heard the noise of a car stopping at the entrance of the property and went to the window to see. Mr. Silas came alone this time, without Mr. Vernon, without Mr. Ronald. He was a tall man, with shoulders that still carried the muscle from years of hard work, completely white hair cut short, large hands. He was around 65 years old and had the kind of presence that filled the room even before he spoke. Caleb went out to meet him. The two stood facing each other at the entrance of the shed, with the residual smell of oranges still in the air. Silas looked at the plastic buckets, at the bottles lined up on the counter, at the improvised Pure Root label. "You're smarter than I thought," he said without greeting. Caleb didn't respond. "I want to buy the formula," the old man continued. "I'll pay you whatever you ask. A good amount, enough for you to start a life somewhere else comfortably." "It's not for sale," Silas scratched his chin. "Son, you don't understand what's in front of you. I have distribution, I have structure, I have the capital to get this product into every market in the region in 6 months. It'll take you years to get there with plastic buckets and glass bottles. It's simple math." "Maybe," Caleb said slowly, "but the formula was my grandfather's before it was mine, and I'm not selling." Silas stared at him for a long while, then he gave a small, joyless smile. "You'll regret this." He turned and left. Caleb stood still, watching the car disappear down the dirt road. The firmness he had felt during the conversation began to slowly melt away as the silence returned. He had turned down a man who had already shown he was capable of dumping a pile of rot in the middle of his land, and he didn't know what would come next. It came 5 days later. A municipal inspector showed up at the entrance of the property on a Monday morning with a clipboard and a uniform that looked freshly pressed. He was young, with a formal manner that tried to hide a certain discomfort. "We received a complaint about irregular production of food without registration," he said, without looking directly at Caleb. Caleb felt his stomach turn. "That's not food. It's a cleaning product. The complaint specifies that there is production of orange derivatives without health registration. Orange derivative for cleaning isn't food. They're different categories." The inspector wrote something on the clipboard. "Still, there's the issue of artisanal production registration. Without the correct registration, commercialization becomes technically irregular." "What registration? Where do I register?" The inspector explained a bureaucratic process that involved technical reports, forms, fees, and inspection visits that would take weeks. Until the process was completed, the sale of the products had to be suspended. Caleb kept his voice controlled throughout the entire conversation. When the inspector left with his citation, he closed the warehouse gate, walked over to the bench outside, and sat down with his back against the old wood, staring at the grey sky. He stayed like that for nearly 20 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Beverly. "I know what happened," she said, before he could even finish explaining. "I've heard of other times Silas did this to people he didn't want to see grow. Too bad it works." "What do I do?" "Get it straightened out. There's a way. But you'll need help with the technical part, because the process is full of requirements that us lay people don't understand. You need someone who knows the product registration side." Caleb was silent. "Do I know anyone like that?" "I don't know, son. You're the one who'll have to figure that out." The discovery came in a way Caleb didn't expect. 2 days after the inspector's visit, while Caleb was in the warehouse inventorying the bottles he hadn't been able to sell and trying to calculate how much longer he could hold out without income, he heard footsteps at the entrance. It was a young woman about his age, with a canvas backpack slung over her shoulder and a notebook under her arm. She had black hair tied in a ponytail, a direct expression that didn't hide the assessment she was making of the place as she looked around. "Are you Caleb Miller?" she asked. "I am." My name is Lauren, Lauren Harrison. He recognized her by her last name before he recognized her face. Harrison was the last name of Mr. Ronald, the quietest of the 3 ranchers who had ordered the rotten oranges to be dumped on his land. Caleb crossed his arms. What do you want? She didn't back down at his tone. I want to talk about Pure Root. She paused. And about how to get the product regularized before the citation deadline turns into a bigger problem. Caleb stared at her. Why would I want to talk about that with the daughter of Mr. Ronald? Lauren held his gaze. Because I graduated in agronomy 8 months ago and worked for 3 months at a consulting firm that does exactly this kind of product regularization, because I know what needs to be done and how long it will take. And because, she paused again, choosing her words, I saw what they did to your land that day, and I didn't take part. I stayed in town. That caught Caleb off guard. Your father was there. I know. Her voice had a heaviness to it. And that's why I came here. Not for him. For me. The silence between them lasted several seconds. Tell me what you know about the regularization process, Caleb finally said. Lauren opened her notebook. They sat at the warehouse entrance for over 2 hours. She explained clearly what was needed: technical reports proving the composition and safety of the product, registration in a specific category of artisanal cleaning product, documentation of the raw materials and the production process. It wasn't simple, but it was doable. She had contacts at the college lab where she had studied, which could do the reports at a lower cost than a private lab. Why would you do this? He asked at the end. What's in it for you? Lauren closed the notebook. A small share of future profits if the product takes off. I don't want money now. I know you don't have any. I want to be a minority partner in something that's growing, and I want my name tied to that, not to my father's name. Your father will find out. I know he will. She said this with a casualness that hid something more complicated. But that's my decision. Caleb was silent for a while. He looked at the bottles lined up in the warehouse, to the grandfather's notebook on the workbench, to the mountain of oranges outside, smaller now, but still there. I need to think. You've got 2 days before the citation deadline turns into a formal lawsuit. Caleb nodded. Lauren left down the dirt road, her backpack bouncing on her back. Caleb watched until she disappeared around the curve. He stayed up all night weighing the situation from every angle. He knew the proposal made sense. He knew he needed someone with technical knowledge he didn't have. But trusting the daughter of one of the men who had spread rot on his land went against every instinct he had. He called Mrs. Constance at 7 in the morning. The old lady listened to everything in silence. Do you know Lauren? Caleb asked. By sight. I know she's not cut from the same cloth as her father. Ronald is a weak man who follows Silas because he's afraid of being left out. The daughter is different, always has been. As a child, she would already argue with her father when he did something she thought was wrong. Ronald never knew what to do with a daughter like that. Would you trust her? Mrs. Constance took a moment to answer. Trust is built over time, but a person who comes from far away to help when they don't have to, that says something. The rest you'll figure out along the way. Caleb called Lauren before lunch. You can start. The first week of working with Lauren was awkward. There was no direct discomfort, but there was a lingering tension that neither of them named. She arrived early, worked in silence, asked objective questions, wrote down answers. He replied with the same objectivity, without closing off the space needed for the work to flow, but without opening up more than necessary. She systematized the cleaner's production process with a precision that Caleb admired in silence. She identified at which stage the fermentation was being done inconsistently and proposed an adjustment that made the product more uniform across batches. She also suggested a change in packaging. Instead of glass bottles, use plastic spray bottles, which were cheaper and more practical for the end user. Glass gives a more artisanal feel, Caleb noted, but the cost is higher and more breaks during shipping. For the scale you want to reach, plastic with spray is what works. He considered it and agreed. The lab report arrived 2 weeks later. It confirmed the product's effectiveness on wood, metal and stone surfaces and attested to the absence of corrosive or irritating substances at the concentrations used. It was the main document they needed for formal registration. When Lauren submitted the complete documentation to the responsible municipal agency, the process the inspector had initiated was dropped, and the registration was granted in stages over the following weeks. Caleb went back to selling. Beverly ordered 80 bottles. They sold out in less than a week. It was at that point that Lauren arrived with a new proposal. "There's a small distributor that serves grocery stores and corner shops in 4 cities in the region," she said, placing a sheet of data on the warehouse workbench. "I talked informally with the manager. He wanted to know more. Can I schedule a formal meeting?" Caleb looked at the sheet. "You already went there?" "I went to talk on the way back from the lab when I picked up the reports. I thought it was a good opportunity." He looked at her. There was something about that initiative that left him conflicted. On one hand, she had gone beyond what he expected, which was good. On the other, she had made a decision without consulting him, which created a boundary issue that needed to be addressed. "Lauren, if you're going to speak on behalf of Pure Root, you let me know first." She looked up. "You're right, I apologize." She said it plainly, without drama. "I won't do it again." He nodded. "Schedule the meeting." What came before the meeting was the hardest blow Caleb had faced so far. Mr. Ronald found out his daughter was working with Caleb on a Wednesday night when his wife, Mrs. Hilda Harrison, casually mentioned at dinner that she had seen Lauren leaving the young Miller's property. Ronald stayed silent for the rest of the meal. Then he got up from the table and went to knock on his daughter's door. Lauren opened the door with her notebook in hand. What followed was an argument that shook the whole house. Ronald's words were too loud not to carry through the walls. He said she was betraying the family, that she was siding with those who were against them, that she didn't understand what she was doing with the Harrison name. Lauren responded at the same volume, saying the Harrison name wasn't something to be proud of in this story, that she had seen what they did to the boys' land, and that she knew perfectly well what she was doing. Mrs. Hilda Harrison sat in the living room, hands clasped in her lap, without intervening. The next morning, Lauren showed up at Caleb's property with red eyes, but the document folder under her arm. She didn't explain what had happened. He didn't ask. She opened the folder and placed it on the counter. "The meeting with the distributor is next week," she said simply. Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and it was more than gratitude for the work. She nodded slightly and went back to her notes. While this was happening, Mr. Silas had been too quiet for Caleb's liking. The farmer's silence wasn't defeat. It was the silence of someone who is planning. Caleb knew that, but he had no way of knowing what or when. The answer came 3 days before the meeting with the distributor. The distributor was run by a man named Edward Pearson, in his 50s, a partner in a family business that had grown from a small neighborhood store into an operation supplying dozens of establishments in the region. He was a straightforward man who showed up at the meeting in a plaid shirt and an old notepad in his breast pocket. Caleb and Lauren had prepared for days. They had the reports, they had product samples with the new label, they had a spreadsheet with sales history from Beverly's grocery store, and a production capacity projection. Lauren had rehearsed the presentation with Caleb twice the night before. Edward listened to everything carefully, asked questions that showed he understood product and market, took a sample to test, and said he'd give an answer in 2 weeks. On the morning of the 12th day after the meeting, Caleb got a call from Edward. "We need to talk in person," the man said in a tone Caleb couldn't decipher. They went to the distributor's office. Edward received them with a more closed expression than at the first meeting. "I had a visit yesterday," he said without beating around the bush. "Silas Brooks came to see me personally. He said there was an unresolved land issue on your property. He said the land was under litigation and that signing a contract with you would mean getting involved in a problem that could affect his business too." Caleb felt his blood run cold. "Does this litigation exist?" Edward looked directly at both of them. Lauren placed the folder on the table before Caleb could speak. "There is a case about water usage rights that is pending judgment," she said calmly. "But we have documentation proving Caleb's usage rights granted by a registered deed from over 50 years ago. The land issue Mr. Silas mentioned Probably refers to that, and it's an unfounded claim. Edward looked at the folder. Can I see that documentation? Lauren passed the folder to him. Edward flipped through it slowly, stopping on a few pages, reading excerpts. This is a copy. Do you have the original registered? Yes, it's at the city's registry office. You can verify it before making any decision. Edward closed the folder and sat looking at it for a moment. I need a week to look into this situation. In the meantime, the contract is suspended. Caleb nodded. Lauren gathered her folder. On the way out, as they walked across the dirt parking lot of the distributor, Lauren stopped. Caleb. He turned. This is going to work. The documentation is solid. If Edward checks at the registry office, he'll confirm it. And if Silas finds another way to block it? She was silent for a moment. One thing at a time. The court hearing for the water rights case was scheduled for Thursday of that same week. A lawyer Caleb had hired with the money from the first sales, a young man named Attorney Gerald, fresh out of law school, but with a seriousness that made up for his lack of experience, had prepared the defense based on the deed Mrs. Constance had kept. One element was missing. Mrs. Constance had agreed to appear as a witness, but when Caleb went to pick her up on the morning of the hearing, she was on the porch with an expression he didn't recognize. Are you feeling okay? I had a bad spell yesterday, she said. Nothing serious. I'm just slower than I'd like to be. He saw that she was pale, that her movements were slower than usual. You don't have to go. Attorney Gerald said the document itself is already... I'm going... She cut him off with a firmness that ended the discussion. Arthur would have gone. I'm going. Caleb helped her into the car carefully. The courtroom was small, with wooden chairs and an air of formality that felt a bit overdone in the simple setting. Mr. Silas arrived with a lawyer in a suit, older and with the kind of confidence that comes from winning many cases over the years. When he saw Mrs. Constance walk in beside Caleb, the rancher narrowed his eyes for a moment. The hearing proceeded with formal language Caleb barely understood, but Attorney Gerald was clear in his defense. He presented a copy of the deed, confirmed the original was filed at the registry office and could be verified, and called Mrs. Constance to testify. The elderly woman sat in the witness chair, with that upright posture she carried despite her tired body. Silas's lawyer tried to discredit the document, claiming it dated from a time when records were imprecise, and that the interpretation of the usage rights could be challenged. Attorney Gerald responded by citing specific articles on the continuity of recorded rights. Silas's lawyer pressed Mrs. Constance with questions about when she had received the document and whether someone had instructed her to keep it. Mrs. Constance answered each question with the patience of someone who is 72 years old and has nothing left to prove. Arthur Ferreira handed me that document in person one afternoon in September, many years ago, as we sat on the same porch where I still sit every day today, she said, looking straight at the lawyer. He said it was a precaution, a careful man with what was his. Ma'am, she turned her gaze to the judge, you can verify the original at the registry. It's there. It always has been. The judge adjourned the hearing, saying she would issue a ruling within 48 hours after verifying the documents at the registry. The decision came the following Monday. Mr. Silas's case was dismissed. The right to use the well was confirmed as belonging to Caleb's property by a recorded deed, with no possibility of further challenge on the same grounds. When Attorney Gerald called with the news, Caleb was in the shed filling bottles. He stopped, set the bottle down on the counter, and was silent for a moment. Thank you, Attorney Gerald. The credit goes to Mrs. Constance. She was unbeatable. Caleb hung up and went to Mrs. Constance's house. The elderly woman was on the porch again with a cup of tea. I know, she said before he could speak. Mrs. Hilda called me. She found out from her husband. Mrs. Constance. Sit here. He sat down on the stool. Your grandfather helped me 3 times in situations I wouldn't have been able to handle on my own, she said, looking at the garden ahead. He never charged anything, never mentioned it afterward. That was Mr. Arthur. What I did was give back something that was owed since long before you were born. Don't thank me. Caleb stared at the old lady for a while. You're a very kind person, Mrs. Constance. She gave a small smile. I'm just old enough to know it's not worth keeping good things without using them. Edward Pearson called the following Wednesday. I went to the registry office, he said. I saw the document with my own eyes. The situation is clear. Mr. Silas came to me with a story that doesn't hold up. Caleb waited. I want to resume the conversation about the contract. The first delivery to the distributor happened 15 days later. 200 bottles of pure root, packed in cardboard boxes that Lauren had sized for shipping. Caleb woke up at 3 in the morning to check each bottle before packing. When Edward's truck left down the dirt road with the load, Caleb stood at the entrance of the shed watching until the engine noise faded. He went back inside and kept working. The second delivery was double that. The third was even bigger, but the peace didn't last long. One Sunday morning, Caleb went to the neighborhood market to buy coffee and found a group of women chatting excitedly near the shelves. When he passed by, one of them recognized him. She had bought the product from Beverly and lowered her voice in a way he noticed. He left the market without buying the coffee. Early Monday, Beverly called. Caleb, there's a story going around. They say pure root damaged a woman's sink here in town, that it stained the stone. He paused. What woman? No one knows the name. It's a story that came from someone who knows someone. You know how it is? He did. In a small town, that kind of rumor spread fast and died slowly. It's a lie. I know it's a lie. But 2 businesses cancelled orders without even calling me to ask anything. Caleb called Lauren. She listened in silence. You won't find out who spread it, she said. But what to do next that we know? We need proof. Evidence that the product doesn't damage surfaces. The lab reports. The reports show the composition, but we need something more practical, more direct. Documented tests on different surfaces, with photos, done by someone the townspeople know and trust. Caleb thought for a moment. Beverly. Beverly. She's known, she's respected, and she tested the product herself at the start. Beverly agreed without hesitation. She spent 2 days testing pure root on stone floors, wood, metal, tile, photographing before and after. Caleb and Lauren organized the results into a simple document with text and photos that anyone could understand. They distributed paper copies at the town's businesses. They sent one to Edward at the distributor. But Edward had already heard the rumor before the document arrived, and he had called an urgent meeting. Caleb and Lauren went together. It was a cold morning, with fog over the road. Edward received them with the documents of the complaints he had gotten. Not from customers, but from 2 businesses that had cancelled orders, claiming they'd heard about the stained sink incident. The manager was tense with his notepad closed, different from previous meetings. I'm not saying I believe the story, he began, but in an operation as big as ours is growing, I can't afford to ignore this kind of complaint. Lauren opened the folder she had brought and placed on the table the document with Beverly's photos and test results, along with the technical reports from the lab and written testimonials from customers she had gathered along with the grocery store. This is the complete documentation on the product, she said. The tests we did, but also tests from a retailer you can call right now to verify. The lab reports, which were already in the registration process, and the testimonials from people who bought and used it. Edward flipped through the material for several minutes without speaking. Caleb sat across from the man, hands clasped on the table, not showing the anxiety he felt. He had learned this from his grandfather. In tense moments, controlled silence spoke louder than any argument. After a long while, Edward closed the folder. "Give me a week," he said. Those were 7 days in which Caleb barely slept. He woke before sunrise, went to the shed, and started working without knowing if there would be anyone to deliver to. Lauren showed up every day, worked in silence, without mentioning the deadline. One afternoon, when it was already past 6 and the sun was low, she stopped writing and stared at the orange grove through the open shed door. "The young trees are coming back," she said. Caleb looked. It was true. With the mountain of rotten oranges nearly completely removed, the insects had diminished. The young trees still had marks from the attack, but the new leaves that sprouted were green, firm, without signs of the infestation from weeks ago. Grandpa planted those, Caleb said. I know. He would never have told me he planted them for me, but he did. Lauren was silent for a while. My grandfather was like that too, she said softly. He didn't talk much, but he did things. It was the first time she had shared anything personal. Caleb noticed but didn't comment. He let the moment be as it was. On the 8th day, Edward called. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Caleb, I want to resume orders, said Edward, his voice regaining the firmness from their first meeting. And more than that, I want to propose increasing the volume by 50% starting next month. The documentation you brought is solid. I talked to Beverly. I spoke with other customers. The product is good. A rumor is just a rumor, and in this area I've seen a lot of good people brought down by rumors. I'm not going to let that happen here. Caleb stood in the shed, phone to his ear, looking at the rows of bottles on the shelf. Thank you, Edward. Don't thank me just yet. You'll need more production capacity to handle the volume. Can you do it? I can, Caleb said, not knowing how yet, but knowing he would figure it out. After he hung up, he was silent for a long time. Then he left the shed and walked to the middle of the orange grove. The cold afternoon wind passed through the trees, shaking the young leaves. The smell was of damp earth and orange blossom, a smell Caleb had learned to love as a child, visiting his grandfather on vacations. He stood there without speaking, letting the moment exist. To handle the larger volume Edward had requested, Caleb needed labor. He used the first bigger payment from the distributor, which arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and seemed higher than he expected when he saw the amount in his account, to hire 2 young men from the community. They were guys he knew by sight, sons of local farm workers who were without steady jobs. The first, named Sam, was 21 and quick to pick things up. The second, named Joey, was slower but more careful, the kind who didn't let anything slip. Together, with Lauren organizing the process and Caleb overseeing quality, production doubled in 2 weeks. The shed had become a different place. It had new shelves made of treated wood that Sam had helped assemble, batch labels that Lauren had systematized, boxes organized by production date. There was a small table in the corner where Caleb spent his afternoons doing accounts, with his grandfather's notebook beside him, always beside him. Mrs. Eleanor came to visit on a Saturday afternoon that was sunnier than usual for that time of year. She walked into the shed and slowly looked around, her eyes moving over the shelves, the lined-up bottles, the Pure Root label with the orange color she had suggested one afternoon while they talked. She didn't say anything for a long while. Then she went over to the corner where her grandfather's notebook was and stood looking at it. Your grandfather would be proud, she said in a low voice. Caleb had his back to her, checking a box. He stopped. I hope so. She turned to him with eyes shining, but without letting a tear fall. It was her way of crying. Her eyes would moisten, but she wouldn't let it go. You didn't sell, she said. Even when I asked you to, you didn't sell. Grandfather wouldn't have sold. No, he wouldn't have. She placed her hand on the side of the notebook without touching it. And that's why he built something that lasted long enough to reach you. Caleb went over to her and stood beside her, looking at the same notebook. Mom, I needed what he left behind, not just the land. The notes, the methods, the way he thought. Without that, I wouldn't have known what to do with the rotten oranges. Mrs. Eleanor was silent for a moment. He knew he was leaving something. He didn't know how it would be useful, but he knew it would be. They stood there for a while without speaking, in the shed that smelled of oranges and old wood. Mr. Ronald showed up on a weekday morning when Caleb wasn't expecting him. He arrived alone, by car, stopped at the entrance, and sat for a while before getting out. When he stepped out, he had his cap in his hand instead of on his head, which in that region was an unconscious gesture of respect that older men still carried. Caleb was in the shed. He saw him through the window and went to the entrance. The two stood facing each other at the doorway. Ronald was a man of average height, sunburned skin, light brown eyes that carried something Caleb hadn't seen that first day by the roadside, or maybe it had been there, and he just hadn't noticed. "I came to talk to you," Ronald said, his voice lower than Caleb expected. "Go ahead." The man was silent for a moment, as if he were arranging his words in a way that wouldn't go wrong. "What I did, that day with the oranges, I knew it was wrong. I went because Silas asked me to, and I didn't have the courage to say no. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth." Caleb looked at him. "I needed you to tell me that back then." "I know." Ronald lowered his eyes. "I came too late." "Yes. Lauren." He paused. "She's everything I should have been with this land. She knows what's right and goes after it without needing anyone's permission. I wasted a lot of time asking Silas for permission over things that were mine to decide." Caleb was silent for a moment. "Are you going to keep working with Silas?" Ronald shook his head slightly. "I haven't spoken to him in 3 weeks. After what happened in court with the water lawsuit, he changed, angry. I don't want any part of it." A bird passed through the branches of the nearest orange tree, making a small noise before disappearing. "I can't undo what happened," Ronald said, his voice close to breaking. "But I wanted you to know I'm not proud of what I did." Caleb looked at the man for a long time. "It's all right, Mr. Ronald." The farmer nodded once, put his cap back on, and returned to his car. Caleb stood there until the car disappeared down the road. That night, when Lauren stopped by to sign some documents, Caleb mentioned his father's visit. She stopped writing. "He went there?" "He did. Said what he needed to say." Lauren stared at the table for a moment. She didn't ask what was said. Maybe she already knew, or maybe she preferred not to know yet. "How did you feel?" she asked. Caleb thought. "I wasn't angry. I wasn't satisfied. I felt relieved, maybe. In a way I didn't expect." Lauren nodded slowly. "He's not a bad man," she said carefully. "He's a man who made bad decisions for a long time. That's not the same thing." "It's not." They sat in silence for a while, with the sound of the wind outside and the smell of oranges inside. Mr. Silas's last attempt came from where Caleb least expected it, through Sam, one of the young men he had hired. Sam approached him one morning with an uneasy look that Caleb noticed before any words were spoken. "What's up?" "A man stopped me yesterday on my way home," Sam said without looking directly. "Offered me money to get the product formula. Said you wouldn't need to know." Caleb stood still. "What man?" He didn't give a name, but from the car and the way he talked, I think it was Silas. Silence. "And what did you say?" Sam looked up. That I wouldn't do it." Pause. "I came to tell you because you have the right to know." Caleb looked at the young man for a while. Then he reached out his hand. Sam looked at the hand, then at Caleb's face and shook it firmly. "Thank you, Sam." That late afternoon, when everyone had left and the distribution hub was closed, Caleb sat outside in his orange jacket, looking at the orange grove at dusk. The young trees had grown back strong. The white flowers appearing on the higher branches were a sign he had been waiting for months. He thought about Mr. Silas, how the man had tried everything, first with the measly offer, then with the rotten oranges, the water lawsuit, the city inspector, the rumor, the attempt to bribe an employee, and he had failed at every turn. Not because Caleb was smarter, but because every blow Silas had tried to strike had, without meaning to, created a piece of what the young man needed to grow. The rotten oranges had created the product. The water lawsuit had uncovered the document proving the land rights. The inspector had forced the regularization that made the product more professional. The rumor had created the documentation that finally won Edward over. And the attempt to bribe Sam had created a loyalty that no amount of money could have bought. Caleb looked at the flowers in the orange grove until the sun set behind the trees. Mr. Silas showed up at the property one last time. He came alone on a weekday morning when only Caleb and Lauren were at the distribution hub. There was no threat in his demeanor this time, nor that presence that filled the room. He was a man who seemed to have shrunk a little, as if the weight of what he had tried and failed to achieve pressed heavier than his own body. Caleb received him at the entrance. Silas looked at the distribution hub, at the boxes ready for delivery, at the orange Pure Root label visible on the shelves. "You made it," said the old man without anger in his voice. There was something different there. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was an old fatigue. Caleb didn't answer. "I came to say I won't interfere anymore," Silas continued. "Not because I changed my mind about the land, but because I lost. I lost in a way that leaves no further recourse." He paused. "And because I'm old enough to know when it's time to stop wasting energy on a lost battle." Caleb looked at the man. "You had the chance to do this differently from the start." "I did. You could have offered a fair price. You could have come to talk like a decent person. Could have waited to see what I was going to do with the land before deciding I was a problem. Could have." Silas held his gaze with visible difficulty. "I didn't." Silence. "I hold no grudge, Mr. Silas," Caleb said finally, with a calm that surprised even himself. "But I'm not interested in a partnership, a business conversation, or any kind of deal. We'll each go our own way." Silas nodded once, slowly. "All right." He turned and left. The car disappeared down the dirt road just as it had arrived, unhurried, without drama. Lauren had heard everything from inside the shed. When Caleb walked in, she was looking out the window, her back to him. "It went differently than I expected," she said without turning. "How so?" "I expected you to hit harder." "Why?" Caleb went to the workbench and picked up a jar to check the seal. "I didn't need anything else from him. Not an apology, not punishment. I just needed him to stop." Lauren turned and looked at him for a moment. "Did your grandfather teach you that?" Caleb thought about it. "Not directly, but he never wasted words on what wasn't going to change anything. I learned by watching." She nodded. They went back to work. 3 months later, Pure Root was being sold in 4 towns in the region. The small business had a registered name, new packaging that Lauren had designed with a print shop from the city, and a second product line in development, an organic fertilizer made from pressed orange pulp, just as Grandpa Arthur had described in the brown-covered notebook. Caleb had hired a third employee, a woman named Faith who had worked in farming for 20 years and knew the fruit fermentation process better than any course could teach. She controlled the fermentation quality with a precision that Caleb jokingly called a gift. "It's not a gift, no," Faith would reply every time. "It's experience. The difference is, anyone can have experience, but a gift sounds like something that falls from the sky." Sam and Joey had grown into their work. Sam had suggested an improvement in the bottling process that reduced waste by nearly 20%. Joey had organized the inventory in a way that Lauren adopted as the official standard. There was something alive in that shed. One afternoon, as Caleb checked the accounts at the small table in the corner, Lauren approached with a sheet of paper. "I got a message from the distributor," she said. "Edward is asking if we have the capacity to add 3 more cities to the route, starting in the second half of the year." Caleb looked at the paper. Then he looked around the shed, at Sam, Joey and Faith working, at the full shelves, at the open door, letting in the smell of the restored orange grove. "Do we have the capacity?" "With new equipment and 1 more person, yes." "Then answer yes." Lauren went to write the reply. Caleb stood looking out the open door. The young trees were heavy with blossoms. In a few months, they would be the first oranges from the restored grove. The first to pick, the first to sell, the first to come from trees that Grandpa Arthur had planted but never saw bloom. The brown-covered notebook hung on the shed wall, inside a simple wooden frame that Sam had made one Saturday, without anyone asking. Hanging there, visible from any spot in the shed, like a silent reminder of where it all began. None of the employees had asked why the frame was there. Anyone who knew Caleb understood, and anyone who didn't would learn. Mrs. Eleanor came to visit one hot Sunday afternoon, the first cloudless Sunday in weeks. She walked into the shed with a scarf on her head and a market bag, as if she were an ordinary visitor, but her eyes swept over everything with that attention she had never lost, even after decades of hard work. She stopped in front of the frame with the notebook inside. He hung it on the wall, she said more to herself than to her son, so he wouldn't forget where it all begins. She stared at it for a while. Then she sat down on the wooden chair next to the counter, hands in her lap, and stayed silent for a moment that Caleb didn't interrupt. "When you were little," she began, her voice softer, "and you'd come visit your grandfather, he'd take you to the orange grove early in the morning. You'd come back with your hands smelling like oranges and always said you'd stay there when you grew up." Caleb stopped what he was doing. "I said that? Every visit?" A small smile. "I'd say no, that I was going to live in the city and study and have an easier life. And you'd stay quiet, but the next day you'd go back to the orange grove." Caleb looked out the window at the trees outside. "I don't remember saying that." The body remembers even when the mind forgets. She got up from the chair, picked up her grocery bag, and went to the counter, starting to unpack the supplies she'd brought with the ease of someone at home. Caleb watched her for a moment, the mother who had worked her whole life as a housekeeper, so he could have what he needed, who had asked him to sell the land out of fear and stayed silent when he refused, who had carried the first bottles under her arm, without making any promises, and had set everything in motion in a way even she hadn't planned. "Mom." She stopped and looked at him. "Thank you." Mrs. Eleanor looked at her son for a moment. Then she did that thing she did when she didn't want emotion to go too far. She wiped her hands on the cloth and went back to the bag. "Are you going to help me put these groceries away or just stand there staring at me?" Caleb went to help, and from the orange grove through the open window of the shed, the scent of orange blossoms came in with the afternoon breeze, mixed with the distant sound of birds, the smell of damp soil, and the stillness of a place that had been insulted with rot, and had answered slowly and with hard work with life. The mountain of rotten oranges had been gone for months. Where it had been, the soil had been treated with the very pulp Caleb had processed, and now a patch of herbs grew there that Faith had planted on her own. No one had asked her to. But there it was. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Do you think Caleb did the right thing by never giving up on his grandfather's land? Leave your opinion in the comments. Your like and subscription to the channel mean the world to us.